Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on racism in the criminal justice system. The learning goals for this week are: what factors explain the rise of mass incarceration in the United States? How are disparities in the criminal justice system reflective of institutional racism? How is the rise of mass incarceration tied to large-scale economic trends? And what are the collateral consequences of mass incarceration? So the reading talked about the history of incarceration and race, where with the end of slavery came a rise in Black incarceration. Vagrancy laws facilitated the incarceration of Black formerly enslaved men. The 13th Amendment allowed forced labor as punishment for crimes. This was known as the convict leasing program, where convicts are leased to work for free or very low pay. The system of convict leasing still exists to this day. Mass incarceration in the United States has more people in prison than any other nation in the world. And the United States today incarcerates people at a higher rate than at any other time in history. In the US, Black and Hispanic people are overrepresented in prisons. Black people equal 13% of the overall population, but 30% of those imprisoned. Hispanic people represent 18% of the overall population, but 22% of those in prison. By the end of 2017, Black males were 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white males. In 1975, the ratio of Black to white arrests for drug crimes was 2-to-1. By 1990, the ratio was 5-to-1. In 2015, 6% of all Black males ages 30 to 39 were in prison, compared with 2% of Hispanic Latino males and 1% of white males in the same age group. And so these charts and images really sort of capture this discrepancy between Black and Latino prison numbers and representation versus representation of white individuals in prisons. 1 in 3 Black males in the United States will be in prison at some point in their life, compared with 1 in 6 Hispanic or Latino males and 1 in 17 white males. This image here represents the percentage of drug offenders at different levels. At the federal level, nearly half of all inmates are in prison for non-violent drug offenses. Overall drug-related offenses account for 1/5 of the incarcerated population. Here we have gender thrown into the mix of the rate of incarceration in 2017. Much of the racial ethnic disparity is due to imprisonment for drug crimes, even though people of all races use and sell drugs at similar rates. And so you see here the incarceration rate per 100,000 for everyone, men, women, and then we see the significant discrepancy between Black and Latino men and women. For women, the numbers of women who are incarcerated have also increased dramatically over the last few years. Women of color are incarcerated at a higher rate than white women, and incarceration of women has a more immediate and direct effect on their children. Women are more likely than men to have experienced physical and sexual abuse in their lives. One study found that nearly 80% of women prisoners had experienced some form of abuse in their lives. Many of the women serving time for violent crimes are in jail for retaliating against their abuser. Now, even though the number of people incarcerated has been increasing for the last few decades, the crime rate has actually been decreasing since 1993. You see that represented in these 2 graphs. The one on the left, property victimization rate has been falling, as has violent victimization rate as well. So it begs the question, if the rate of crime is decreasing, why are the number of people incarcerated increasing? One of the responses to that comes, again, looking historically at what has happened, particularly since the 1980s, that has impacted that increase in the prison population. At the federal level, 3 major laws marked the beginning of a new era in criminal justice. The 1984 Crime Control Act established mandatory minimum sentences and eliminated federal parole. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 set a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for offenses involving 100 grams of heroin, 500 grams of cocaine, or 5 grams of crack cocaine. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 included a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for simple possession of crack cocaine with no evidence of intent to sell. So how does the criminal justice system perpetuate racial inequality? Here, once again, we get to talk about racial profiling. There's this one particular study that revealed that only 13% of all cars on the New Jersey Turnpike had a Black driver or passenger, but that 35% of those stopped on the Turnpike were Black, and 73.2% of those arrested were Black. So there's been, and you probably, many of you have probably heard over time, a lot of conversation of racial profiling, particularly when during traffic stops, right? And then what happens during those traffic stops to African Americans is significantly different than what happens to white drivers. We also see discrepancy in sentencing disparities. Blacks are 21% more likely than whites to receive a mandatory minimum sentence when facing an eligible charge, and Black drug defendants are 20% more likely than white drug defendants to be sentenced to prison. Another area in the criminal justice system that we see these disparities is around the death penalty. Between 1976 and 2002, only 12 people were executed for crimes in which the defendant was white and the victim Black, compared with the 178 Black defendants who were executed after having been convicted of killing a white person. So we're still punishing African Americans more significantly when the victim is white than when the defendant is white and the victim is Black. The reading also talks about mass incarceration in a global context to sort of serve as a comparison to the United States. In most other developed countries, first-time drug offenders receive no more than 6 months in jail. Rehabilitation is more common than criminalization. In countries like Germany and the Netherlands, once released from prison, offenders do not face restrictions on voting or welfare benefits. So this is significantly different to what we do in the United States. And so, you know, it invites you to think about how different the experiences would be for African Americans and Latinos who are imprisoned disproportionately if these were the kinds of strategies used for dealing with drug offenses and drug addiction in this country. Now, the reading also talked about the economics of mass incarceration, right? Who benefits from having so many prisons? And in particular, talks about the case of California. In California, had built only 12 prisons between 1852 and 1964. Yale built 23 major new prisons between 1984 and 2004. And this is explained by what happens during this time period to the economy in California. And what happens is a decline in the defense industry, which was a significant source of jobs in California. And so this led to a rise in unemployment. Prisons were built, excuse me, prisons were built to create jobs on the one hand, and on the other to imprison those that turned to drugs. There was also an abundance of formerly agricultural land that has suffered as a result of a drought. These lands were sold to build prisons. The California example leads us to question, who do prisons really benefit, and what are they really built for? We also see that the Corrections Corporation of America has been significantly influential, investing in lobbying to get federal contracts, including contracts to build prisons for immigrant detention, right? So that's another area in which we see a significant increase in people incarcerated. The reading talks about this idea of the prison industrial complex as the vast network of prisons, jails, courts, and police officers that are not designed solely to control crime. A confluence of interests has led to the building of more prisons, the enactment of harsher laws, and the mass incarceration of poor people. The prison industrial complex has come into being because it serves the interests of powerful groups in our society. Politicians have used a tough on crime approach to gain votes. They create fear among the white middle class around crime and lack of safety to gain their support for tough on crime laws. Recent case in point, Trump's description of Mexican male immigrants as quote unquote bad hombres who are rapists, right? So this kind of language creates this fear that's not, again, not based on data, because as we saw, the number of crimes have actually been decreasing. The mass media also benefits and participates in this, having highlighted local crime to attract viewers. Rural areas have turned to building prisons to boost local economic development. So prisons has become the answer for a lot of different things in our society. So what are the collateral consequences of mass incarceration? Studies conducted in the United States have found that the imprisonment of a family member negatively affects family communication, mental health, physical health, finances, and educational outcomes. Michelle Alexander became well known by writing this book called The New Jim Crow, pointing out how mass incarceration results in a significant loss in rights and discrimination against people because of race, color, national origin. And you see them, people who have a criminal record, felons can be legally excluded from employment, housing, voting, public benefits, and jury service. So while it is illegal to discriminate against people based on race, color, or national origin, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against a person because of a felony record. And we see the impact in the 2016 election, where 6 million people were prevented from voting. The reasons given: laws restricting voting rights for people with felony convictions. And you see sort of the disenfranchisement that takes place throughout the country as represented in the map. So what happens to felons once they become come out of prison? Are they able to get jobs? Well, according to one study, callbacks for people who apply for jobs, you see this discrepancy between 5% of Black men who are felons get a callback versus 17% of white men, whereas non-felons, 14% of Black men get a callback versus 34% of white men get a callback. So Black men who do not have a criminal past or a criminal record are still less likely than white men who do have a criminal record from getting a callback for a job. The reading also talks about, how do we reconcile, right? Again, sort of looking at prisons in an intersectional kind of way. How do we reconcile prisons and the fight against domestic violence? The feminist domestic violence movement has heavily relied on the use of the police and imprisonment as solutions for addressing domestic violence. The Violence Against Women Act in 1994 aimed to get police to respond more to complaints of domestic violence and to take those cases seriously. This, however, also led to mandatory arrest and minimum sentencing laws. Carceral feminism is the term used to describe the reliance on increased policing, prosecution, and imprisonment as a primary solution to gender-based violence. Solutions are viewed through a white middle class perspective, which ignores how the criminal justice system impacts people of color and immigrants differently. So it requires us to think or rethink or question what are the solutions to addressing domestic violence, and is relying on the criminal justice system the best strategy. The prison abolition movement argues that prison reform is not the solution because prisons themselves are sites of violence and can never be adequately reformed. So the reading talks about this idea of transformative justice as a way to address interpersonal violence without relying on state violence. And state violence here is perceived as prisons. This addresses not only the needs of the person who was harmed, but addresses the conditions that enabled the harm. So to conclude, mass incarceration has been accepted by American voters because crime control is considered a crucial element of a safe society. Although again, there is no evidence to demonstrate that crime has been increasing. Mass incarceration results in denial of rights, primarily to African Americans, who are the largest number who are imprisoned. Mass incarceration is not an effective crime control strategy, nor an effective way to address drug use. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your thoughts in the discussion posts. Have a good week.